It's the year 1873, deep in the haunted heart of Mississippi, where the echoes of the Civil War still rattle through crumbling plantations. The air is thick with secrets, blood, and whispers of forbidden love. But among all the stories buried beneath magnolia trees and graves without names, there was one tale so unthinkable, so shocking that even time itself tried to erase it. A story of a slave and her mistress, bound first by cruelty, then by desire, and finally by something far darker than love. In the humid, trembling heart of Mississippi in 1873, the air itself seemed to hold its breath when whispers began to spread about the forbidden union between a woman who had once worn shackles and the mistress who once held the key. The land was still bleeding from the wounds of the Civil War, and though the Emancipation Proclamation had been declared a decade before, freedom was a fragile thing. It hung in the balance like Spanish moss over the crumbling remains of the plantations where ghosts of the Old South still clung to their fading glory. In this world of decay and denial, the mere suggestion of love between a former slave and her mistress was not just scandal, it was heresy. The story begins on the outskirts of a small town near the Yazoo River, where the Blackwood plantation stood in eerie silence. The grand house, with its tall columns and cracked white paint, was once a symbol of power and prestige. But by 1873, its splendor had rotted into melancholy. The mistress of the house, Evelyn Blackwood, lived alone, surrounded by the remnants of her family's fortune and the ghosts of those who once toiled beneath her gaze. It was said she walked the halls at night, whispering names long buried, lighting candles for souls no one dared remember. Among them was one name that surfaced more often than others: Clara. Clara had been born into bondage under the Blackwood name. She was small, quiet, and carried herself with a kind of stillness that made even the cruelest overseer uneasy. As she grew, she was chosen to serve inside the main house, attending to the young mistress. Over time, the boundaries that defined servant and master began to blur in ways that defied the social fabric of their world. Behind the closed doors of the Blackwood estate, there were moments when the cries of pain turned to whispers of something else. Something intimate, forbidden, and terrifying to anyone who might have heard. When the war ended and the world began to change, Evelyn's family was destroyed by the same fire that consumed the South's illusion of control. Her father shot himself in the library when he learned the Confederacy had fallen. Her mother fled to Georgia and never returned. The fields grew wild, the workers left, and Evelyn remained, her sanity slowly unraveling inside a house that was too big for one woman's guilt. And yet, she was not entirely alone. Clara stayed behind, not out of duty, but out of something deeper, something unspoken. Those who saw her said she moved through the house like a shadow, silent, unseen, and utterly devoted to the woman who had once owned her. In the small town nearby, tongues wagged. The women of Hollow Creek whispered that Miss Blackwood had gone mad, that she talked to herself and spent her evenings in the parlor dressed in mourning black, though no funeral had been held in years. Some said they saw a dark figure walking beside her in the gardens after midnight, a figure who never seemed to cast a shadow beneath the moonlight. It wasn't long before one rumor overtook the rest. Evelyn Blackwood had married her former slave. A claim so shocking, so vile in the eyes of the time, that most dismissed it as madness. But there were those who swore they'd seen it, the two women standing before a broken altar in the ruins of the old chapel behind the plantation, holding hands beneath a cross that leaned as though ashamed to witness it. It was said that the ceremony had no witnesses except the dead. The local preacher had refused them, calling it an abomination, so Evelyn took the matter into her own hands. She read from a Bible whose pages were stained with tears and something darker. The vows they exchanged were not just of love, but of eternity. Those who claimed to have found the remnants of that night, scraps of burned cloth, a cracked ring, and drops of something that might have been blood, believed the ritual was not merely a marriage but a pact. From that moment on, neither woman was ever seen in the same way again. In the weeks that followed, the plantation became a place people avoided. The air around it grew heavy and unnatural. Strange cries were heard from within its walls, sometimes laughter, sometimes sobbing, sometimes both tangled together until it was impossible to tell which was which. The minister of Hollow Creek claimed he saw smoke rising from the house, though no fire ever burned. Travelers passing by at dusk said the windows glowed faintly, as if the house itself had eyes. Still, Evelyn and Clara remained. The town's men gathered more than once to confront them, to drive out what they called sin and blasphemy, but each time they approached the gates, a storm would break over the fields, forcing them back. One man, a former overseer who had once punished Clara for stealing bread, dared to enter the property. He was found the next morning on the riverbank, his mouth full of mud, his eyes wide with something that resembled terror. After that, no one dared go near. As years passed, the tale of the mistress and the slave who dared to marry became a kind of ghost story told to frighten children. Some said the two women had died together, locked in an embrace, poisoned by their own sin. Others believed they simply vanished one night, leaving the house to decay around the echo of their voices. Yet those who ventured close swore that, if you listened closely near the old chapel, you could still hear soft footsteps on the stone, and a woman's voice reciting vows to someone who would never leave her side. The forbidden union that defied law, faith, and death became a legend too terrible to forget and too strange to ever fully believe. The whispers of the forbidden marriage had barely settled when darker murmurs began to crawl through Hollow Creek, twisting like smoke through the humid Mississippi nights. The story of Evelyn and Clara was already enough to ignite scandal in every corner of the South, but the union itself was not what terrified people most. It was what came after. The strange happenings, the quiet deaths, the uneasy feeling that something unseen had followed them home from that chapel in the woods. People began to believe that love had not been the only thing binding them together. There were secrets exchanged beneath that leaning cross, promises that did not belong to the realm of God. And whatever was said that night between them, it had awakened something that refused to be silenced. It started with small things, almost forgettable at first. The servants who came to tend the grounds would return pale and trembling, refusing to speak about what they saw. They said the mirrors in the house no longer reflected properly, that sometimes, when Clara passed by, her reflection lagged behind as though caught in another time. Doors opened on their own, even when locked, and candles burned with a strange blue flame that gave off no heat. Evelyn dismissed it all as superstition, but the look in her eyes betrayed something else. Fear mingled with fascination. She had always been drawn to the forbidden, to the edge of reason, and now it seemed she had stepped beyond it. Neighbors began to notice Evelyn's appearance changing. The fair-haired beauty who once turned heads in town now seemed pale, hollow, as if drained by something unseen. Her voice, once soft and melodic, took on a tone that chilled those who heard it. Clara, on the other hand, seemed untouched by time. Her skin glowed in the candlelight, her movements smooth and otherworldly. It was as though one's vitality was feeding the other, a quiet exchange of life that no one dared to explain. Evelyn stopped attending church, stopped speaking to anyone outside her home. When the local preacher came to her door with a Bible and a warning, she met him with a calm smile and closed the door in his face. That night, his house burned to the ground while his family slept. He survived, but his hands were scarred beyond healing. He claimed that as the fire raged, he saw two women standing in the flames, untouched, watching him through the smoke. Soon after, the animals on the neighboring farms began to die. Horses were found lying still with no visible wounds, their eyes clouded and black. Chickens stopped laying eggs. Dogs refused to go near the plantation fence. The few who dared to investigate swore that the earth near the Blackwood property felt warm underfoot, as if the soil itself pulsed with life. Even the river that ran behind the property seemed to have turned sluggish, its water darker than before. By midsummer, Hollow Creek had become a place of silence. The people crossed themselves when they heard Evelyn's name. A traveling doctor who was summoned to the plantation after rumors spread of Evelyn's sickness reported hearing two voices whispering from the same room, though he saw only one woman lying in bed. He described her eyes as glassy, her lips moving in prayer, but the words were in no tongue he recognized. Clara stood by the window, watching him closely, her hands clasped as though she were holding something invisible. The doctor left before nightfall, and when questioned in town he refused to return, muttering that some illnesses were not meant to be cured. Letters began arriving at the sheriff's office, anonymous notes scrawled in panic, claiming Evelyn was performing unholy rites under the full moon, that she had buried something alive near the chapel ruins. The sheriff ignored them at first, calling it nonsense born of fear. But when one of his deputies disappeared after going to investigate, leaving behind only a hat and a trail of footprints that stopped abruptly in the mud, even the law began to tremble. The sheriff himself rode out one morning, determined to end the madness. He returned before dawn the next day, his face white as bone, refusing to speak a word. He resigned a week later and left town without warning. People said Evelyn and Clara rarely ventured beyond the plantation after that, but lights were often seen moving across the fields late at night, small orbs, glowing red like embers, floating between the trees. The old chapel where they had exchanged their vows began to crumble, but the air around it stayed thick with a smell of burned roses and damp soil. Some nights the wind carried voices through the town, low and mournful, as if two women were weeping for something they could never have again. Children were warned never to go near the Blackwood property, but of course some did. One boy, the son of a carpenter, swore he saw Clara standing by the river at dusk, her dress dripping though she hadn't entered the water. She looked at him and smiled before vanishing into the mist. He never spoke again after that day. The town elders called for a priest from New Orleans, hoping to bless the land and rid it of whatever evil had taken root. When he arrived, he walked the grounds at sunrise, sprinkling holy water and chanting Latin prayers. The birds stopped singing. The wind died. By sunset, the priest was gone. His carriage was found days later on the edge of the swamp, his belongings intact but no sign of him. Inside the carriage was a single page torn from a Bible, soaked in something that smelled faintly of blood. By the end of that year, Hollow Creek was nearly deserted. The plantation stood silent once more, its windows black and unwelcoming. But travelers who passed by on foggy nights told the same story again and again. They saw two women walking hand in hand along the porch, their faces pale in the moonlight, their eyes glowing faintly as they turned toward the road. Some claimed they heard vows being whispered in the distance, the same words repeated endlessly like a curse, binding them together beyond life and death. Whatever love began that night in the chapel had turned into something else, something neither holy nor human, a dark bond that consumed everything around it and left only shadows where hearts once beat. By the time the strange lights began to flicker over the plantation fields, the town of Hollow Creek had fallen into a kind of terrified silence. No one spoke the Blackwood name aloud anymore, not even in whispers. The people who still lived nearby carried crosses made of willow and kept salt at their doorsteps, convinced that the evil on that land was not bound by fences or laws. They said the union between Evelyn and Clara had opened something that could not be closed again, that in sealing their bond, they had drawn upon a force too old and too hungry for human understanding. As fear grew, so did the stories, each one darker and more impossible than the last. The first to speak of witchcraft was an old woman named Martha Bell, a midwife who claimed to have known Clara as a child. She said the girl had been born under a blood moon, her mother dying moments after her first breath. According to Martha, the women on the plantation had always whispered that Clara was marked by something unnatural. Animals followed her wherever she went, even the wild dogs that roamed the edge of the woods. She was said to have a voice that could soothe or frighten with equal power. When she grew older, her presence alone could quiet a crying infant or send a restless horse into a frenzy. The masters ignored it as superstition, but Martha insisted that Clara had inherited a gift or a curse that no prayer could undo. When the news of the marriage spread, Martha muttered that whatever had been dormant in Clara had finally been awakened. Soon others began to add their own tales. A man who delivered supplies to the plantation claimed that he saw strange symbols carved into the trees near the chapel ruins, symbols that shimmered faintly under moonlight as though freshly cut. Another swore that he heard singing coming from inside the house, low and rhythmic, like a chant. The language was not English, nor French, nor any tongue he recognized. He said the sound seemed to come from both women, their voices weaving together until it felt like the air itself was vibrating. Those who listened too long reported headaches, nightmares, and in one case, blindness that no doctor could explain. As fear deepened, religion turned to hysteria. The town's preacher began warning his congregation that the women of Blackwood had bound themselves to the devil, that the strange lights and the unearthly calm surrounding their property were signs of an unholy covenant. He claimed that the plantation's soil was cursed, that it would swallow anyone who dared to trespass. One evening during his sermon, a violent wind tore through the church, shattering windows and snuffing out every candle at once. When the light returned, the preacher's Bible had been reduced to ashes in his hands. From that day forward, he never spoke of the Blackwood name again. But the most unsettling accounts came from those who claimed to have seen Evelyn and Clara together. They were no longer seen as mistress and servant, nor even as human. Some said their movements were too synchronized, their gestures too mirrored, as if one mind was inhabiting two bodies. When Evelyn appeared in town to buy supplies, her eyes seemed darker, unfocused, and people said Clara's shadow followed her even when Clara herself was nowhere to be seen. There were rumors that Evelyn no longer cast a reflection in mirrors, while Clara's image would appear in places she hadn't been. A traveler staying at the Hollow Creek Inn once reported waking in the night to find two women standing at the foot of his bed, their hands intertwined, their mouths moving in perfect unison. When he screamed, they vanished, leaving behind the faint smell of roses and decay. The townsfolk grew desperate to rid themselves of whatever was haunting them. They turned to old rituals passed down from enslaved people and early settlers alike. Salt circles were drawn around homes, ashes were scattered along doorways, and prayers were whispered into bottles before being buried under oak trees. Yet still, the nightmares continued. People began to dream of the plantation, of its long halls and flickering lights, of a woman's laughter echoing through the dark. Children woke, crying, claiming they had seen a pale woman at their windows asking to be let in. The fear that once divided the town now united them in superstition. No one dared travel the road past Blackwood after sundown. There was talk of burning the house, of erasing it from the earth entirely, but each attempt failed. Men who ventured near the property would lose their way, even in daylight. Compasses spun wildly, and the path seemed to shift underfoot. Some said the land itself protected them, that Clara's power had seeped into the soil, binding her and Evelyn to the very foundation of the home. Others whispered that Evelyn had called upon something older than God, something that had been buried beneath Mississippi long before the first settlers arrived. Whatever it was, it now had a home and a bride. The rumor that sealed the town's fate came from a traveling preacher passing through Hollow Creek months later. He claimed that he had spoken to a man from a neighboring county who had seen the two women alive long after they were presumed dead. He described them as ageless, their skin unmarked by time, their eyes hollow but aware. He said they were collecting the bones of the dead, gathering them in the chapel as offerings to something unseen. When he tried to follow, the preacher said the woods turned black, the air thick as tar, and a voice whispered from the darkness that love was a debt never paid in full. The townspeople listened in horror but could not dismiss it. Some fled Hollow Creek that very night, abandoning their homes to the encroaching wild. Those who stayed did so out of stubbornness or fear that leaving would only draw the spirits to follow them. The Blackwood house stood untouched, a decaying monument to everything the town wanted to forget. And yet, every now and then, someone would swear they saw candles burning in its windows, two faint silhouettes moving together inside, bound forever by something no human hand could break. The whispers of witchcraft, the talk of curses, and the fear that the mistress and her slave had summoned a power greater than death became the town's legacy, a secret that would not stay buried, a truth too terrible to face but too persistent to die. After the rumors of witchcraft spread through Hollow Creek, something far worse began to unfold. It was not merely the presence of evil that terrified the townsfolk, it was the sense that it was growing stronger, that every passing night fed it in ways no one could explain. The Blackwood plantation no longer seemed a house of brick and wood, but a living, breathing creature that pulsed with unseen energy. The windows glowed faintly at night, sometimes red, sometimes white, and when the wind moved through the fields, it carried with it the faint sound of laughter, soft and mocking. The air grew colder near the gates, and animals would not cross it. Those who lived nearest began to lose sleep, plagued by dreams of women standing in doorways, whispering to them in voices they almost recognized. The first true horror came in the spring when the McAllister family, who lived less than a mile from the Blackwood property, began to suffer strange misfortunes. Their crops withered overnight, though the fields of their neighbors remained untouched. Chickens were found headless, their bodies arranged in perfect circles. The youngest child, barely 6 years old, woke screaming one night, claiming a woman had been standing at his bedside, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes black as river mud. The following morning, the boy refused to speak at all, and within days, The entire family packed what little they owned and left town. They told no one where they were going, and no one ever heard from them again. The disappearance of the McAllisters was only the beginning. Within weeks, 3 more families reported hearing footsteps around their homes at night. One woman said she saw a shadow move across her window, though her husband was away on business. Another claimed she heard the sound of a piano playing faintly in the distance, an old melody she recognized from the Blackwood estate when she was a child. Every account shared one detail: the presence of a low humming, almost a lullaby, that grew louder the longer one listened. It was said to lull the listener into a trance, filling their mind with images of the plantation, of long corridors lit by candlelight, of 2 women dancing slowly beneath a ceiling that dripped with decay. Then came the deaths. The first was Thomas Reed, a farmhand who ignored the warnings and went hunting near the old chapel ruins. His body was found 2 days later, face down in the mud, his skin pale as snow. There were no marks on him, no wounds, but his eyes were open wide, his mouth twisted in horror. The coroner could find no cause of death beyond what he called fright. Within a month, 2 others met similar fates. One man found hanging from a tree near the river, another drowned in a puddle barely deep enough to cover his nose. Every corpse bore the same expression, as if they had seen something their minds could not survive. The town's fear turned into collective madness. People stopped leaving their homes after dark. Lamps were kept burning through the night, and prayers were whispered at every window. The church bell rang constantly, not for services, but to keep the silence away. Yet even with the sound of its tolling, the night seemed longer, heavier, and filled with movement. Some swore they saw figures walking along the road at dusk, 2 women hand in hand, their faces veiled, their steps leaving no prints in the dirt. Others claimed they heard singing from the direction of the plantation, mournful and sweet, followed by sudden screams that broke off too quickly to be human. When the few remaining brave souls dared to investigate, they found the plantation in a state of haunting beauty. Vines had overrun the walls, and the house seemed to shimmer faintly under moonlight, as though it were covered in frost. Inside, everything was preserved exactly as it had been years before. The parlor smelled faintly of perfume, and the piano still bore a thin layer of dust, except where a few keys had been recently pressed. A faint imprint of a hand lingered on the mirror in the entryway, but there was no sign of life. Upstairs, the bedroom doors were locked, but from behind one of them came a faint, rustling sound like silk brushing against the floor. None of the men who entered stayed long enough to discover what caused it. They fled before dawn, swearing never to return. Soon after, a sickness began to spread through the town. It was not an ordinary illness. It came without fever or cough, only a deep exhaustion that drained the life from its victims. They described vivid dreams of the plantation, of standing in the chapel surrounded by candles, of hearing a woman whisper their names. A few woke screaming, clutching their chests, unable to explain the terror that had gripped them. Doctors from neighboring counties came to examine them, but could find nothing wrong. The afflicted would grow weaker each day until their hearts simply stopped. Every one of them was buried quickly, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses that began to decay faster than they should have. The land around Hollow Creek began to rot. The once fertile soil turned grey, the trees leaned as though bowing under invisible weight, and the river's current slowed until it barely moved at all. It was as if life itself was draining away, feeding something that thrived just beyond human sight. Travelers avoided the road entirely, saying that the air near the plantation grew thick enough to choke on. Those who passed by claimed they saw a figure at an upstairs window, watching them go, her face blank, her hand pressed against the glass. Even as the town emptied, the haunting continued. The few who remained said that on nights when the moon was hidden, the whole sky seemed to glow faintly above the Blackwood property, as if lit from within. Shadows moved across the windows and faint laughter drifted through the fields. When the wind shifted, it carried a smell of burning candles and wilted flowers, a scent both mournful and strangely sweet. Some nights the chapel bells rang without human touch, echoing across the fields in tones too pure to be real. Those who heard it said the sound filled them with sorrow so deep it felt like their hearts would stop. No one dared speak openly of Evelyn and Clara anymore, but everyone knew that whatever had begun as love had turned into something else entirely. The deaths, the lights, the sickness, each was a reminder that the bond between them had become a force neither human nor divine. Their presence lingered in the soil, in the air, in the dreams of anyone who dared remember their names, and though the house stood in silence, the curse of their union continued to spread like roots beneath the earth, reaching for anyone who came too close. Years passed, and Hollow Creek faded from maps and memory, swallowed by vines and silence. The Blackwood plantation stood as the last sentinel of what once was, its walls leaning inward like a body that refused to fall. No one dared to approach it anymore, though stories of what remained within traveled farther than the town itself. Travelers spoke of hearing faint music drifting from the overgrown property, an old waltz that rose and fell with the wind. Others swore that at dusk, two figures could be seen walking the grounds, moving in slow, graceful circles, as if still bound in an eternal dance. The land had become a monument to what everyone feared but could never truly understand. And then, in the summer of 1912, the truth began to surface. One that would unravel everything the town had tried so hard to bury. A group of surveyors sent by the state stumbled upon the ruins of Hollow Creek while mapping the new railway line. They found little more than remnants of chimneys and skeletal foundations, but deeper within the forest, half consumed by the swamp, they discovered the Blackwood house still standing. The porch was caved in, the windows shattered, but the interior, strangely, was intact. Furniture remained untouched. Portraits still hung on the walls, though the faces had faded into near obscurity. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint, sweet scent of lavender. But what struck them most was the silence, an absolute stillness that pressed against their ears like the absence of air. It felt as if the house itself was listening. In a locked chest beneath the parlor floor, they found something that changed the course of local history, a leather-bound journal belonging to Evelyn Blackwood. Its pages were brittle, stained with age and what appeared to be dried blood, but its words were legible enough to tell the story no one had ever fully known. The entries began innocently, filled with descriptions of plantation life, her loneliness after the war, her loss of family and fortune. But as the pages turned, the writing shifted. She began to speak of Clara, not as a servant, but as something she could not live without. There were mentions of dreams, of voices calling to her at night, of seeing Clara's face in mirrors even when she wasn't in the room. Her tone grew more desperate with each passage, as if she were documenting a descent into both passion and madness. Then came the entries dated from the summer of 1873. Evelyn wrote of the secret ceremony in the ruined chapel, how they spoke vows not meant for mortal ears, how Clara had drawn symbols on the floor using ashes from the fireplace mixed with her own blood. Evelyn confessed that she could feel something moving beneath the earth as they spoke their vows, that the candles flickered without wind and the ground seemed to tremble underfoot. She described how Clara looked at her, her eyes darker than night, her voice soft and distant as she promised that death would never part them. In the following pages, Evelyn wrote that she began to hear whispers in her sleep, not just from Clara, but from something older, something that had accepted their oath. After the discovery of the journal, the surveyors left immediately, unnerved by what they had found. But word of the find spread quickly, drawing the attention of historians and curiosity seekers. Within weeks, a small team of researchers arrived to study the plantation. They catalogued the relics and explored the grounds, noting the unnatural preservation of certain rooms and the strange symbols carved into the doorframes. In the overgrown chapel, they uncovered remnants of what appeared to be a ritual site. Candlesticks fused into the stone floor, bones arranged in circles, and fragments of blackened fabric that seemed untouched by decay. Beneath the altar, they unearthed a small box wrapped in rotted silk. Inside was a pair of gold rings, still gleaming, intertwined by a lock of human hair. When the journal was examined more closely, the later entries revealed something even more disturbing. Evelyn's handwriting became erratic, looping and fragmented, filled with words that bled into one another. She wrote that Clara no longer needed to sleep, that her body grew colder each day, but her eyes burned with a strange light. Evelyn described waking in the middle of the night to find Clara standing over her, whispering words that made the air tremble. She claimed the two had merged somehow, that she could feel Clara's heartbeat within her own chest. Her final pages descended into near incoherence, written in both English and a language no scholar could identify. The last line before the ink trailed off read simply, "She promised we would never be apart again, not even in death." The researchers who handled the journal began to experience misfortune almost immediately. One fell ill with a fever that no medicine could treat. Another began hearing voices at night, whispering the same phrase over and over in an unfamiliar dialect. A third vanished while cataloguing items from the plantation, his tent found empty, his tracks ending abruptly in the mud. The state soon sealed the area, declaring it unsafe for public access, but rumors spread that the house still stood, untouched by decay or time. Locals claimed that anyone who wandered too close would hear music drifting through the trees and see the faint outline of two women dancing in the moonlight, their faces expressionless, their hands still bound by invisible thread. Years later, the diary was archived in a historical collection, though few dared to study it. A curator who spent several nights transcribing the text reportedly went mad, speaking of a voice that came from the pages themselves. He said the book was not written by one person, but two, that the handwriting changed subtly in places, as if Evelyn and Clara had both contributed, their words merging seamlessly. He died before his work could be completed, leaving behind notes filled with cryptic references to living ink and the vow that breathes. The truth that had been hidden for decades began to reveal itself in fragments. The marriage that defied God and man had not been merely symbolic. It had bound their spirits to something beyond mortal comprehension. The diary was proof of their devotion, but also of their damnation. What began as an act of forbidden love had become a ritual that trapped them between worlds. Their story was not one of romance, but of possession, not of life, but of endless return. The plantation, the lights, the whispers in the trees, all were remnants of a bond too powerful to die. And though the world had changed, the house remained, waiting in the silence of the swamp, its windows forever watching, its halls forever echoing with the sound of vows spoken long ago.